and welcome to Discovering Your Story Genealogy Basics from the Rhode Island State Archives. Thank you for joining us. Look forward to having you here this afternoon to learn about general genealogy and information, but also information on the collection here at the State Archives and what we can do to help you through your genealogical research. We are here today to share about our resources, but also to provide insight into how you can take your research further from home without ever having to leave where you are to research with our collection. So first and foremost, we just wanted to focus on the treasures that we have here at the State Archives. We are home to more than 10 million Rhode Island history records. That is the overall general collection. And what we do daily, we preserve those records on behalf of the people of Rhode Island. We have over 975,000 online vital records and indices. And then we also have more than 100 years of city directories. So we have a really vast collection that we make available day to day for the people of Rhode Island so that you can gain access to the collection and learn from what we have here. So I'm going to pass the baton here over to my colleague, Rich Height, who's going to walk you through and dive in more thoroughly into foundations of what we have and then how to really take your genealogical research forward. So again, thank you for being with us and take it away, Rich.
Thank you, Ashley. In my opinion, there are two primary building blocks for reconstructing family lineages for the 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States. Vital records, that is, records of births, marriages, and deaths, and then the other one is census records. The Rhode Island State Archives has both, and they are the most useful records for genealogists when they're in the early stage of trying to trace lineages back further than they already have them. Vital records. These can be called the cornerstone of genealogical research. They are the sources genealogists most often turn to first to trace families back for more generations than they already know. And when they're available, they provide the most useful information for that purpose. Rhode Island began requiring the statewide recording of births, marriages, and deaths in 1853. That does not mean that they are 100% complete. Recording them was required by law, but there was little means to enforce it, especially for those living in isolated areas. The State Archives has the earliest of these records. Currently, the Archives has the state's birth records from 1853 through 1924, marriage records also 1853 to 1924, and death records from 1853 until 1974. These records are all initially filed in the Vital Records Office of the Department of Health. For privacy reasons, birth and marriage records remain at the Department of Health for 100 years after the event, and death records stay there for 50 years. After those lapses of time, the records are turned over to the State Archives. Now, from 1853 until the summer of 1921, these records were maintained in ledger books. Beginning in July 1921, individual certificates were issued for each of these events. The Archives only has birth and marriage certificates from the latter half of 1921 through 1924. And we have individual death certificates for Rhode Island from the summer of 21 through 1974. In most situations, the obvious first place to look is a birth record. For example, if you're looking for an ancestor born in 1859, you will want to look at 1859 birth records. And let me point out that the earlier records were prior to individual certificates were all maintained in ledger books, which we have. But the ancestor born in 1859, you'll want to look at 1859 birth records. Well, if you're not sure of which town this ancestor was born in, that's no problem. We have statewide indexes. The earliest of these statewide birth records are going to give the name of the child, date of birth, the names of the parents, the race of the child, the occupation of the father. That early, it was assumed that mothers would be housekeepers with no job that earned income, and the birthplace of each parent. In some instances, the maiden name of the mother might be given. That became more frequent as time went on. Through the years, birth records got more detailed. Eventually, they gave information such as the age of each parent and the number of children the mother had previously given birth to. I cannot cite a specific year for this because there were variations from town to town and when they began this. Marriage records are equally informative. From the very beginning in 1853, they gave the date of marriage, the names and ages of the bride and groom, the place of residence, and the birthplace of each one. Again, race, the occupation of the groom, and the names of the parents of both parties. If one gets lucky, the maiden name of a mother might be included. For people born in Rhode Island in the 1830s and 1840s, these are the most obvious records to use to identify their parents, because while they may have been born too early to have their births recorded, a marriage record will give that information. People are generally going to know the names of their own parents, so these are pretty reliable sources of that information. Now, occasionally you can run into a glitch. For example, someone whose mother died in childbirth and whose father remarried within a year or two might name his or her stepmother here, because the stepmother might be the only mother the person ever knew. Checking marriage records for siblings of the bride or groom, if you have that information, is a good idea for comparative purposes. 3 or 4 records giving the same parents' names are always better than one. Now, for people born earlier in the 19th century or the last quarter of the 18th century and who died after 1853, a death record may be the only vital record in existence. Death records give the date and place of death and the age. The age might just be a year, but in some cases it's down to the day. As an example, 80 years, 4 months, and 17 days. And that allows one to calculate the exact date of birth. They'll also give the occupation of the deceased, although in the earliest records that specifies that that's only if it's a male above the age of 15. And of course, they also ask the question of race. The cause of death is given, and there is a slot that asks for the names of the parents. There is no certainty that that slot will be filled, though, and the information on that is only as good as the knowledge of the person who provided it. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It's part of what I would refer to as written oral history. That is, history that is written based solely on what people remember from the past. Now, if the decedent had a living spouse, that person is a likely candidate to provide the parents' names, but if not, a child of the deceased is more likely. In any case, if the names of the parents are given, no one should take it for granted that the names are correct, especially if the maiden name of the mother is included. In many cases, the earliest death records only give the name of the deceased person's father anyway. Again, if one knows the names of any siblings of the deceased, it's a good idea to check their death records as well. Ultimately, one may need to check probate records in towns to prove the names of parents of people born and married prior to 1853. But the clues given in death records, when they're there, should never be ignored. While no statewide source of statewide vital records exists prior to 1853, there are some available. James N. Arnold, who was editor of the Narragansett Historical Register, compiled and published what he could extract from town records in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some of these records date back as far as 1636, when the colony was established, but they are sporadic at best. The reference archivist here, Ken Carlson, estimates that about 15% of the marriages that took place in the colony and later the state were recorded prior to 1853. only about 10% of births, and no more than 2 to 3% of deaths. When they were recorded, they rarely included as much information as the later records. For example, marriage and death records were unlikely to note the names of the parents of those involved. These records could be extracted from town meeting records, town council records, or land evidence. There were also towns that began keeping vital records before the state mandated it. The ones in town council records could have been created when a resident of a particular town simply decided to enter the record of his family there. He might have brought his Bible along to a town meeting and had the names of himself, his wife, and the names of all his children recorded, along with their birth dates. The archives has copies on microfilm of nearly all of the records that Arnold cites in these publications, along with the publications themselves. The exceptions are the records from New Shoreham and 3 volumes of records from Warwick. Now, Arnold also lists births, marriages, and deaths that were mentioned in newspapers. The archives does not have copies of newspapers in its collections, but we do have Arnold's volumes that cite those entries. Okay, now this slide sums up who has vital records and from which time periods in Rhode Island, and what the state archives can and cannot certify. For any vital records prior to 1853, the municipalities retain the original manuscripts, and the state archives can only provide non-certified microfilm copies. For births and marriages since 1853 that are more than 100 years old, the state archives has it and can certify it. The same is true for deaths since 1853 that are more than 50 years old. For births and marriages from the past 100 years and deaths from the past 50 years, the Department of Health still has them, and they can certify them. The state archives does not have them and will not until they are more than 100 years old. Okay, I had mentioned census records earlier. While vital records document specific individuals at the time of major events in their lives, census records reconstruct complete households. At various moments in time, government entities compile census records for the purpose of documenting the populations under their jurisdictions. These listings of complete households often provide in one record information that it would take 10 or more vital records to compile. The state archives has census records dating from the colonial period, and microfilm copies of the surviving federal census records for the state of Rhode Island from 1790 through 1930, and the existing census records compiled by the state. The earliest colony census record is from 1774. And then there's a military census from 1777, which cites only men of the appropriate age to bear arms. And there's also a state census from 1782. I should point out here that there is also a census record that only lists heads of households in Providence in 1776, but the archives does not have this. After 1782, the state did not compile a census again until 1865, and it was continued after that every 10 years until 1935, notably in the years that fell between federal census years. The census records prior to 1850, colony, state, and federal, only list heads of households by name. They then break spouses and children down by age categories, and they got more specific as time went on. The 1790 census only lists the numbers of males age 16 and above in the household, the number of males under the age of 16, and the number of females without providing any age breakdown. By 1840, they were breaking children of each gender down into age groups of under 5, of age 5 but under 10, of 10 but under 15, and of 15 but under 20. For adults, each gender was broken up into 10-year increments from the ages of 20 and under 30 up to between 19 and 90 and under 100. And then there was also a category for 100 and above. The 1850 federal census was the first one to name every person in the household. That being the case, this census makes it possible to trace most families back a couple of decades earlier than the statewide vital records can. In most cases, children 15 and younger were still living with their parents, and in a large number of instances, people in their early 20s who were still unmarried continued to live at home. So in the 1850 census, one might find people born as early as the 1820s still living in their parents' household. This census gives the name of each individual, the age and place of birth. It's no more specific than the state if they're born in the United States, and it just names the country if born outside the United States. Now, as time went on, census takers began asking for more information. Starting in 1880, they asked for the relationship of every person in the household to the household head. A husband, if living, would be listed as the household head. If not, a widow would be listed. The wife would be listed as the wife of the household head, and each of the children listed as son or daughter. In some cases, an elderly parent of the husband or wife might be there and listed as father, mother, father-in-law, or mother-in-law. There could be brothers and sisters of the household head, nieces or nephews, or unrelated people who just might be listed as servants or boarders. This continued for every census through 1930, and actually beyond that. 1930 is just the most recent one we happen to have here. Now, another piece of information that began to be included in 1880 was the birthplaces of parents of each person listed, state or country. This is another piece of information that has to be classified as written oral history, because one cannot assume that everyone knew precisely where their parents were born, and there's always the chance that the person who provided the information was not the individual cited in the record. Beginning in 1900, census takers began noting the year of arrival in the United States for foreign-born residents, whether or not the person was a naturalized citizen, denoted by NA, an alien, denoted by AL, or had filed citizenship papers, but the process was still ongoing. That's identified by PA. In 1910, people were asked if they spoke English or not, and if not, what language they did speak. In 1920, immigrants were asked what their mother tongue was, even if they spoke English by that time. The children of immigrants were asked the mother tongue of their parents. Now, I should point out that although we only have microfilm copies of the federal census records through 1930, the ones from 1940 and 1950 are available for public inspection now. They are so widely available online, though, that we don't have we've never gotten microfilm copies of those census records. Now, the first of the state census records of Rhode Island to list every member of the household was 1865. They're sporadic in how useful they are to genealogists. The 1865 and 1875 censuses list every member of the household in much the same fashion as the federal census records. For individuals born in Rhode Island, they include a specific piece of information that the federal records do not. They give the name of the town the person was born in. Now, the 1885 census is not nearly so useful because it does not organize people by household. 1895 exists only for Providence. The 1905 census includes cards for each individual listed and gives an address. Women are listed separately from men, so to reconstruct an entire household, one must look through every one of a particular surname and note the ones at the same address as the specific individual being searched for. 1915 and 1925 are more conventional. They list every member of the household and also note whether or not foreign-born residents are naturalized. Then 1935 is similar to 1905. The State Archives also has a collection of published city and town directories from all over the state, but it is far from complete. Some are on microfilm and some are actual printed copies. The earliest one that the archives has is an 1824 directory of the city of Providence. Actual relationship information in these records is limited, but looking for the others with the same surname can lead researchers to hints about connections. Following a family in directories over a period of several years can also show how long they lived at a specific address or in a specific town. Usually the only name listed is the household head, whose name is given with the street address and usually his occupation if it's a man. Of course, in some cases, when it is a man, the wife's name may be given in parentheses. For widows, the name of her deceased husband may be given in parentheses. But there are other clues that can be found. For instance, people in their late teens or and early 20s who still live with their parents and have jobs might be listed separately, but at the same address. The relationship should be confirmed with vital records, but it's an important clue. The archives does have some military records, and these are among the other resources that may be of potential interest to genealogists. In terms of the military records we have, we're particularly strong for the colonial era wars, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War I. There are some records also of the so-called French and Indian War, the 1750s and 1760s, known in Europe as the Seven Years' War. Then there are some of the Spanish-American War and World War II, but our collections for those wars are nowhere near as extensive as the others. Naturalization records are federal records, so they are not housed in the state archives. There are some records here, though, that pertain to naturalization. For instance, the city of Providence had records called immigration cards from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries, and we have those here on microfilm. Some towns maintain lists of naturalized residents, and we have some of those. Other locales had voter cards for them. I already mentioned the evidence for naturalization that can be found in census records. But for more informational naturalization, we suggest contacting the other two locations listed on the slide here. The Supreme Court Judicial Records Center in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and then the nearest branch of the National Archives, which is in Waltham, Massachusetts. The addresses of both are on this slide, but you can also easily Google them and find them. The web addresses are there. Now, I'm going to get here into some pitfalls to watch for in genealogy and they are summed up here. A name found in a vital record might actually be from another branch of one's ancestry. In my own research, for instance, I once found a death certificate that had the wrong maiden name for the mother of the deceased. I later learned that it was actually the maiden name of his mother-in-law. But any type of information can be falsely remembered by family members, and it's not unheard of for these items to appear in vital records and census records. Names may be spelled incorrectly. Parental birthplaces may not be accurate. Not everyone necessarily knew where their parents were born, and in the cases of census records and death records, someone other than the individual referenced may provide the information. In fact, in the case of death records, I think that's certain. Birth dates on death records may not be right. They are only as good as the knowledge of the person providing the information, and death records are created at stressful times for those who provide information. So that always has to be taken that always has to be taken into account. Now, a number of common legends occur in family after family. One is featured on this slide, the idea that family names were changed at Ellis Island. I'm sure that some of you remember this scene from the movie The Godfather Part 2. The young Vito Andolini has just arrived at Ellis Island in this scene. The registrar is asking him his name, and of course he can't understand English. Another employee reads his card and tells the registrar, Vito Andolini from Corleone. So the registrar just says, Corleone, Vito Corleone, and writes it that way in the manifest. But this scene is entirely fictionalized. In reality, the registrar would have had the ship's manifest in front of him with the name already entered. He would have then just checked off the young Vito Andolini's name. Now, this is not to say that immigrants did not legally change their names after arrival. Many did. Others learned some English before coming to this country and entered an anglicized version of their names in the manifest before departure. So names were in fact changed, just not at Ellis Island. Another widespread tradition that many Americans have in their families is that of a Native American ancestor. For some reason, regardless of where people are from, the tribe most commonly identified is Cherokee, and the ancestor is usually a Cherokee princess, so to speak. I recall one story a genealogist posted about being told as a child that he was a descendant of a Cherokee princess named Parasada. When he began researching, he did find out that he had a great-great-grandmother whose name was Parasadi, which is very similar to the name that he was told. But there was no indication in any records of her that she was a Native American. Eventually, he located some old family correspondence between her and her father, and he found out that her father's pet name for her was Princess. 4 generations later, her descendants had turned her into a Cherokee princess. Now, in 4 decades of research, I have found traditions of Native American ancestry in 6 separate lineages in my own background. None have turned out to be true, and this is not unusual. I have done DNA tests, and there's no trace of it. Although nearly every family whose ancestors arrived in this country prior to the 19th century has that tradition, it seems that it's actually quite rare that it's true. The DNA testing company 23andMe, for example, estimates that only 2.7% of Americans of European descent will find detectable Native American DNA. For African Americans, about 1 in 5 will find it. Now, I should point out that the chances of having Native American ancestors are far greater for those with roots in Canada than those whose ancestors came directly to what became the United States. There was far more intermarriage in Canada in the colonial era that involved Native Americans being absorbed into European society. But some information on government records, even when wrong, can provide clues that will help in locating correct answers. For instance, the death record of one of my great-grandmothers gave the maiden name of her mother as Hamilton, spelled the same way as the surname of Alexander Hamilton, although there was no indication of a relationship to him, and I never suspected it. But that was a lineage I spent several years trying to find more about. My grandmother had given me 2 different possible first names for this ancestor's father. I looked through the 1850 census records of the county they lived in and several adjoining counties without success. But then I learned of some gravestones in the area with a different spelling of the name. And it's on the slide here. Hamble. Now, that was an entirely different spelling I had never heard of. Never considered that possibility. But I checked that name on the 1850 census, found her parents right away, and since then I've been able to trace the family back 3 more generations. Now, before I turn this back over to Ashley, who's going to talk about our online resources, I'm just going to mention a few tips for handling physical records. When pulling books off the shelf, don't grab it by the head cap. That is the top. If it's shoved further in than the adjoining books, it's best to pull one of those out to make it possible to grab the book you want in the middle. And when working with loose items, the materials should be kept on the table flat and the original order should be maintained. They should also be moved carefully to avoid damage. I feel I should dispel the widely believed idea that one should wear white gloves while reviewing such items. Those make it harder to handle documents and create potential for damage. And finally, when reviewing bound volumes of original documents, supports for the documents should be used when they are available. We have some in our reading room here. And also, when turning pages, only the blank areas of the pages should be touched. Now I'm going to turn this back over to Ashley now, who's going to talk about our online resources.
Thank you, Rich. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for sticking with us. I'm just going to give you a very quick high-level overview of using our online resources. So we've made many, many, many thousands of records available online so that you can couch surf and internet surf our records all at the same time. We've tried to make it a one-stop shop just for you. So if you visit our site right off the Secretary of State's website, you would just go to sos.ri.gov and then from the left side, pick State Archives, and it will bring you to the page you see on the screen here. If you want to see where records are that are frequently asked about, you can click that "Where is that record?" box over on the left side. That will show you common records that were asked about outside of vital records, just for general information on kind of FAQs. But if you're specifically looking for those birth, marriage, and death records, you're going to want to click over on the right side where it says birth, marriage, and death records. And that's where you're going to get further information on how to access those in our online portals here. This is where that brings you to. This gives you the information on the years of records that we have available, the way to request certified records, but then also where to go if we do not have a record. All of that is on this page here. To actually access and go through and look at the digital collection itself, you're going to click that blue button that says View Birth, Marriage, and Death Records. I would like to note on the right side of the screen, there is the What Are State Vital Records, which just gives a little bit of general information. We do also have a button that leads to a page about dual citizenship because we get asked very frequently. We cannot offer dual citizenship services. What we can offer, if necessary, are certified copies of vital records, but that is about all we're able to do, and that page explains that, and then also tells you where else you can look outside of the state archives if that's a journey that you're on. And then the additional family resources button gives you a little bit of additional information, much like Rich reviewed earlier about vital records plus census plus military, if you'd like to digitally look beyond just the birth, marriage, and death records. So when you click on that View Birth, Marriage, and Death Records button, it's going to bring you to our digital archives. Our digital archives has a few different collections listed within it. The very first one is a guide. It says Exploring the Rhode Island State Archives Family History, and that is a step-by-step with screenshots how to use this system that I'm previewing for you right now. From the digital archives, how to navigate and use the indices, and then how to identify from those indices and transfer that information into looking specifically for those birth, marriage, or death records. When you click and look at those and you click on indices, that's the first place you're going to go to identify the record that you need. So you're going to select the date or date range and then the name range. Everything goes in some sort of sequential order. So because there's so much information on these pages, I highly advise you give it a moment as it continues to load, but I promise you it will load. Everything's just a high resolution image, and sometimes it takes just a moment. So as you're in those indices, make sure you select the one you're interested in. For example, the birth, marriage, or death. There's different collection for all three. And then select the years you're looking for, and then the name range. From there, as you begin to look at the specific pages, depending on the year, it may look a little bit different. So we have a few examples on the screen here, but within the index, you're going to be able to find the name, the date of the vital event, the city or town, and then the page or filing number. And when you're doing requests on your own, or if you're reaching out to place your request with us for our assistance with one or two requests, we're going to need that information in order to find your ancestor, because those are the pieces of information that are relevant to either the volumes or the individual filings that we have preserved here. So all of the information in the index is necessary first before we can get to the actual record. So as you can see on this slide here, it has a couple of different versions of how that information was aligned. Because these records go over the course of over 100 years, they obviously changed a little bit over time as practices updated at the Department of Health, or what is now the Department of Health Office of Vital Statistics. So the name is almost always over on the left side, so that's the very consistent piece of information. And then there are different columns for either birth date, for the birth index, mother and father, and then it has the book and page, or as you can see in the second image, it shows you the city or town. So just know that as you're looking at these indices, they're going to be a little bit different each time, dependent on the year. When you go back and look at that guide that I mentioned to you, which I highly recommend, it also has a little bit of like cheat sheet information, as you see on this slide, for what the abbreviation and the meaning of that abbreviation is, so that you have that information right at your fingertips. Once you have identified the date for your vital event, go back to that home page where you can select either birth, marriage, or death record and select which type you need. And then from there, select the date or date range. There are a few different views that you can do. This view here, I'm going to use my mouse for a second, is this one right here so that you can see the full title. But if you want to see it as a grid, you can do so, or you can view it as a grid with kind of a little bit less information around the sides. So that's what these 3 bits are, and that you can customize the view for yourself by using those tools within the digital archive. Once you select the vital type and the date range and get further down where you need to go, you're going to begin to be looking at the records themselves. So there were 2 different formats. These are both the official record, or what many people ask us about as a quote unquote long form record. These are both that official copy. So up until 1921, there was the ledger format, as you see on the left, where all of the information for one vital event was across one line. So it crosses across both of those pages. Or post June 30th, 1921, individual certificates began to be issued. So both of these are the official record. They just look a little bit different. When you're looking to either view or download these from home, I highly recommend for ease of use that you look at the complete volume PDF. So once you get into the proper year and the city or town that you're looking for, so for example, on this screen, you see Barrington births, July to December, for the year in question, which is 1921. That very top one, the little image, is slightly different. It looks like a piece of paper instead of a photo. If you click on that, that will open a PDF instead of individual TIFFs, and then you can scroll through and find the information a bit easier rather than going image by image. If you prefer to go image by image, that is absolutely doable. Just know that the number of the scan may differ from the page number on the document itself. Same with the certificate format. If you open it as the PDF, you can view all of that particular volume as one PDF. So instead of it being in a volume, it's loaded in based on the time period, and you can just scroll your mouse page by page. This actually just gives you the information I just did, which is sometimes there is a slight difference between the PDF page number and the ledger or document number. So just keep an eye on that. So when you're looking and cross-checking the information from the index that you found, the page number listed in the index is going to be the one that's in the little corner of the document itself, this one here. This just tells you the number of pages in the overall PDF, but that's inclusive of things like the title page and the introductory information. So just keep an eye on that information that's in the corner of the record itself, not the PDF. As you're using the PDF viewer, you have several options that are useful in lots of different ways, but first and foremost is the table of contents. In the left corner, you'll be able to click that little box so that you can actually select further, drill down more for what you need based on the research that you're completing. You can also zoom. You can plus or minus depending on what you want to see. That's particularly helpful when you're working with the ledgers versus the individual certificates. When you're completing this research, you can download these from home. You do not need to request a certified copy from us most of the time. You just access it from home and you can download it and keep it with your family records. You can download it, print it, save it. These are public records. They're available to you at your disposal. So that button looks like the little arrow pointing downwards. And then lastly, if you're looking at the individual images versus the PDF viewer, the zoom is in the upper left-hand corner and it looks a little bit different. We just always like to note that for you. So the navigation is slightly different depending on where you're coming from. So just to wrap us up, I want to present you with these bits of information. So the state archives, as Rich shared with you, we have births and marriages 100 years or older. So we get those once a year from the Department of Health once they hit that trigger. And then deaths, that trigger is 50 years. For anything more recent than that, you will need to reach out to the Vital Records Office at the Department of Health. They have a really good online presence as well, so please reach out to their team. If you're hitting a wall and you're not finding a birth, marriage, or death record, you can also check with the census, military records, city directories, and sometimes things like voter cards. So there are secondary sources that can be useful for you. And then last, Rich always gives this great piece of advice of misinformation as a clue that made its way into this presentation after he gave it as an anecdote once, and we've never let him forget it. So even when you come across misinformation, don't get discouraged, just keep digging. And remember to cross-check as you go. It's always best to find the information on more than one record to substantiate what you have found. So those are the big general overviews that we have for you about records here at the State Archives and completing family history research and digging into that genealogy. We hope you enjoyed this presentation as part of Sunshine Week about transparency and access to government records, which these are. And we hope that you will visit us online and interact with our collection. I hope you have a very great day. And again, thank you for joining us.